Okay, well, welcome back, amazing students. Thank you so much for joining us for part 2 of our lecture on theorists and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As promised, I left you last week with a cliffhanger, right? I left you with some thoughts, something to think about related to potentially the causality of homelessness. And we were talking about Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And as a quick refresher, the process of us moving, right, from the bottom of the triangle to the top in order to become the best possible human beings that we could be, right? And so one of the things that we did was we left off with a discussion here. When we last finished, I'd asked you to develop 10 underlying reasons why a person may find themselves without housing. And we left with a video that sort of explored some of the causality and background information to consider regarding individuals without housing local to here in Riverside. So what I would like to do is I'd like to show us one more video. And the next video will be from an individual, Maurice Young, who has a very powerful story to tell related to his situation of finding himself without housing. And after that, what I'm going to do is engage in a conversation based off of the video that you saw last lecture, this current video, and where we might consider alternative ways of viewing the social challenge of homelessness through the eyes of our theorists that we had studied in the beginning of this section. So what I'm going to ask you to do is go ahead and after this slide, jump onto the next slide, which will have Mr. Young's testimony via a TED Talk. Then what we will do is you'll go ahead and jump onto the next slide where we will pick up with the conversation, comparing the list that you have that you generated to some potential causes of individuals finding themselves without homes. And so if the video doesn't work, please don't worry. Again, go ahead and refer to Blackboard and you can bring up the video there and then just return to this presentation.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Maurice Young, and I'm homeless. I am not what some would consider formerly homeless or previously homeless. I am what I would like to think or call myself actively homeless. Today, I've been invited out to talk to you about why I do what I do. Now, this is very different for me because normally when people invite me out to speak, I talk about what I do. And I do that in a way or in the capacity of raising awareness for the homeless and for the homeless community. So today, to talk about why I do what I do, I had to do some soul searching first. And in that process, I looked at the events that have led up to today. But then I said, I need a starting place. So I had to go back in time and try to figure out where did it all start to set these events in motion. So I found myself flashing back to about 25 years or so ago when I was a younger man starting out on that American dream journey. I remember I was driven, I had a list in my mind, a list for success. So I had the do's and don'ts, the do and don't list of success going on in my mind. And on my do list, it was the typical finish college, get that great career, get married, buy the dream house, have kids, et cetera, et cetera. But on the don't list, which was a very lengthy list, there were the top 3 line items was most important to me on that don't list. And they were, don't get a divorce, don't get a divorce, and don't get a divorce. Because I had seen the impact of a divorce, and it was just like devastating to me. So that was what was driving me or kind of set things in motion. So we fast forward to 2011. And here I am coming through divorce number 3, which I think is kind of ironic because that was the first 3 things on that list. So I was in a spot where I was kind of devastated. And I knew that I needed to clear my head because I remember thinking, how did I get here? And this is not where I wanted to be, by no means. So, but I also remember I was thinking very clear at that time, extremely clear, because I remember saying to myself, this is divorce number 3, and who's the common denominator? Yours truly. So I immediately said, I need to clear my head. I need to kind of get somewhere and get a reset or a do-over or something. So I moved myself down to the local shelter, to the men's shelter, and I chose that because I knew nobody in my network, friends or family, would look for me there. So I think, I get to the shelter and all is well. So the first 2 days, it was just how I anticipated. It was quiet, reflective, and I kind of had time to myself to just to see what was going on with me. So as the days progressed, though, I noticed something very interesting. So the homeless people in the shelter were kind of being treated really bad. And it was a turning point for me because I had always considered the shelter to be a part of the faith-based community, and the faith-based community an extension of the church. So the church wouldn't treat the people this way, was my thought process. So I'm the type of person who I'm all about doing something about something if there's a problem. If you're not a part of the solution, you're a part of the problem. So I said I would just assert myself. So I just jumped in there and did what I could do at the mission. So there was one gentleman who would always walk through every day with all these papers in his hands, and I struck up a conversation, and I found out those were applications, and he just needed some help filling out the applications. So the long-term problem there was he couldn't read. So after we got done with the applications, I asked him if I could tutor him. He was excited about that, and then we worked together. Then the second individual in the program was autistic, and he literally needs somebody to hold his hand all the way through the SSI process. And I had all the time in the world, so he became the second person that I helped. And there was quite a few more people that I helped in that process as well. But the one of the gentlemen who really stood out to me was this 18-year-old young man who came into the mission, and he got my attention because at 18 years old, I didn't even know where the mission was, but yet there he was. So we talked, and I found out that his mom had passed away. They lived in Section 8 housing, and he did not know how to conduct that business to transfer whatever needed to be transferred to him. So he left and was at the shelter. His grandmother and him were having a conversation about her setting money aside and buying him a bus ticket, which was about $35, about $35. So, hey, we can do that now. So I asked him if I could help him. He said, sure. We walked to the Greyhound bus station, got the ticket, and all was well. But what was most interesting about that situation, so as he's getting on the bus, he turns around and launches this hug on me, and I'm just like standing there just like I'm overwhelmed. I'm just like, whoa, okay. So he's crying, and then I'm crying. So we're both sitting in Greyhound crying, and I'm trying to figure out, why do I feel this way? I've helped people before, I've done things before, but this was kind of different, and I didn't understand what that was about. So he left, and I headed back to the mission. And this was a very pivotal day because as I got back to the mission, what we normally do, we would go in and sit in a day room and watch TV, or you would sit around in chairs and kind of talk to each other. But next to the day room was a chapel. And I always like to go into the chapel and sit and kind of process the day, journal a little bit, and kind of strategically set up for the following day. So I go around, and I always sit in the same place in the chapel. So I go around the corner, and I go in, and there's a line of people standing there waiting for me. And that was a very profound moment for me because I knew right there as I looked at those faces who just needed some help, very simple help, that's what I wanted to do. That is absolutely, positively what I wanted to do. So that night, I had a conversation in my bunk. What does that look like? What does that look like doing this? And I said, because I can go home and lock up the house, put the cars in the garage, take a few weeks off work, but that's just a camping trip. But what I need to do is I need to create in my life the exact same needs that the people have in their lives. How do I do that? How do I become indigenous to this population? So it became very clear for me. you got to let everything go. So that's what had to happen. And I was okay with that. So when I speak, normally when I speak, people ask me the question, how hard was it to let everything go? So I jokingly tell them, and feel free to laugh, I said, remember I told you I was coming through divorce number 3? It lightened my load considerably. So we forward to today. Here we are today. And there's a quote that resonates with me from the writer and the poet Mark Twain. And it says, the 2 most important days of your life are the day you were born and the day you know why. So unbeknown to me, when I moved myself to that shelter, I was allowing myself to be planted. And this I didn't know. And when I asserted myself with helping the people in the shelter, putting the needs of others before myself, which we did in the shelter, and then after I left the shelter, I became grounded and rooted in something wonderful, something just an unspeakable joy, if you will. So when people ask me today, will you ever go back? Do you miss it? Or, what does that look like? I tell them, listen, whatever I was grounded and rooted in, there was a transformation that took place in that process. My mind has been renewed in sorts. So I kind of see things differently. But whoever I was when I came out of divorce number 3 and who I am today are 2 totally different people. So I cannot go back. In fact, what I anticipate is whatever pushes through the ground, that will be my new life. And that's what I look forward to in the future. So to answer that question, why do I do what I do? Ladies and gentlemen, I humbly submit to you this answer. I do what I do because that's who I am. And I would like to thank all the people who allowed me to come into their lives and help them and be me. Thank you very much.
Okay, I hope you found that video as inspiring and powerful as I did. Maurice's story is such a powerful story because it touches on so many different factors that relate to our theory of lifespan development. If you notice, if we went backwards to this triangle of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you can see that for a period of time, right, Maurice was operating in these higher levels, right, of the triangle. He was married, right? He had a career. He describes life as moving along until in his area of love and belonging, right, relationship after relationship, he found himself disconnected from and ending. And as a result, that greatly impacted his outlook on life, right? And so Maurice embraced the notion of homelessness in order to draw himself closer inward to a self-examination, right, of his own inward being. And so a lot of folks, though, face homelessness for a multitude of reasons, right? Maurice's story, as powerful as it is, represents one story, but everyone's story we know can be a little different. And years ago, I was listening to a radio interview, and I don't know if any of you are familiar, if you listen to Spanish radio, of Piolín, huge Spanish radio disc jockey, okay? Piolín en la Mañana was the name of the show, and he was interviewing a gentleman that was very wealthy. He was a millionaire. And he asked that gentleman what was the secret to his financial success. And in a very humble way, that businessman had basically said in so many words, you know, I'm just very blessed. He said, I think it's important to realize that every person, nearly every person in the United States is 2 paychecks away from being homeless. And he went on to point out that the middle class of America, the majority of us are living paycheck to paycheck, and that we rarely have an opportunity to engage in savings. We are burdened by debt. And so what this speaker went on to explain to Piolín was that all of us find ourselves teetering on this line where one significant disaster financially can lead us to finding ourselves without housing. And that really resonated with me because when I examine the statistics as a social worker of how individuals find themselves without housing, it begins to break the mold of those stereotypes that we assign to individuals without housing. We often see that individuals who are lacking housing were up here in the triangle. And some serious life circumstance, usually resulting in a financial catastrophe, drew them down, right, back here to pursuing their basic physical needs before anything else. And so let's explore some of these causes of homelessness, right? So think about for yourself and then compare this to your list of that list of 10 items that you believe could explain why an individual might find themselves without housing, right? Could you ever become involved in a flood, a fire, tornado, or natural disaster, right? Could any of you find yourselves in that? If you are all coming from different parts of the country and the world, we all have natural disasters here in California. We just expect, right, when that earthquake will hit. Could you find yourself in that situation? And if so, could you recover financially from a complete loss of your house, or God forbid there was a fire or an earthquake and all of your property, all of your vehicles were damaged, right? Could we recover from that? Do you or your family work in an area of the job market where your job might become obsolete? Particularly when we live in the days of COVID, right? We saw a sudden and dramatic halt to all commerce nearly within our environment, within our society. Jobs that were there one day suddenly were gone, right? Businesses that stood one day suddenly went bankrupt. And one thing might be to consider is, where are your jobs within your family, and where might they become obsolete in the event of a disaster? Could you ever suffer a long-term illness or accident without proper health benefits or other compensations, right? Do you have access to a doctor, to healthcare? Could a downturn in the economy, such as like COVID or another recession, right, cause your family to lose their jobs? Do you live in a household with one full-time wage earner? The reason we ask that is because obviously if two people earned wages in your household and your income was hit by 50%, that's a problem, right? But if your income is hit by 100% due to the breadwinner of your household becoming sick, injured, or God forbid something else, would you be able to recover? Are you and your family behind in monthly bills? Do you have high credit card debt, or do you have home in foreclosure, right? These are significant financial issues that can plague an individual and impact their housing. Are housing costs in your area increasing faster than wages are increasing? We see that as a trend across the United States. We refer to that process as gentrification, all right, the process of areas in which rent may have been affordable and accessible to many individuals now becoming astronomically high. Pushing individuals out of lower income, forcing them to live in the streets. Does anyone in your family struggle with alcohol, drug, or other addictions? What we've seen in the past is individuals who do sometimes move from a stage of what's described as a functioning addict or a functioning alcoholic in some senses, to where their addiction begins to take over their daily functioning, and they can no longer sustain work or family relationships, leading to job loss and severed relationships. And finally, do your family have money in your savings or life insurance to cover expenses should your spouse or your partner pass away unexpectedly, right? These are all circumstances, if you see, that happen on a daily basis. We've seen these happen in the last year alone, many of these things, right? I mean, we just think about the news, think about COVID, think about natural disasters and floods and rain and blizzards and earthquakes and all of these things. All of this here are considered life circumstances which impact individuals, and without a savings, we cannot recover. And as a result, we find ourselves in places without housing. So finally, here's some thoughts to consider, right? Applying theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to a practical sense. Homelessness, therefore, is a situation, it's not a person, right? So homelessness isn't always because someone's lazy. It isn't always because someone is, how we describe as crazy, being mentally ill. It isn't always because someone made poor choices, okay? Most individuals without housing, in fact, also have children. So it's also important to understand that if an individual is living out of their car and they're trying to make ends meet to try to figure out where their next meal is coming from, imagine how this cycle of poverty is impacting a child's development down the road. So basic things that we've seen, challenges that come up in life, such as job loss, foreclosures, sudden medical expenses, natural disasters, disease burden, substance dependency, caring for a sick relative, mental illness, whatever the case is, these are all factors to consider, right, that impact an individual being homeless. One quick example, and then we'll move on with the lesson. Right, a couple years ago, I needed surgery, right? I needed to have my gallbladder removed. If you've never had that, try to avoid that at all costs. That is not fun. I'm not going to lie. That was pretty awful. Now, here's the thing. I was blessed, right? I had a job. I have health care. I have a partner a spouse that also brings in an income. And even with healthcare and a copay, do you know what that still cost my insurance for gallbladder removal out of pocket for me, right? With all of those things to have an emergency surgery, that cost me $5,000, $5,000 out of pocket. Now imagine that my circumstances were very different. Imagine that I didn't have a job that was flexible on me missing work as I recovered for 3 weeks with gallbladder surgery. Imagine that I didn't have a spouse that was bringing in an income. Imagine that we didn't have a savings that could cover an emergency surgery just like that. An expense as small as what we may see compared to others as $5,000 can literally put someone on the street. And so that's important to understand. Now, let's take a moment and let's review what our theorists might say regarding homelessness. And let's take this back to the perspective of our theorists, and we'll look at it from a psychodynamic behavioral approach and such. So for now, let's go ahead and end with this slide, and I will pick up with the theorists. Okay, very good. So let's go ahead and bring it back to our theorists, and let's see what our theorists would have to say. So if you remember from the last lecture, we examined the issue of substance dependency, and in standing in the shoes of our theorists, we began to explore what our theorists might say within their theoretical framework of substance dependency and where that might come from, the causality, right? And so for this application, let's go ahead and do this with the exercise of homelessness, right? So psychoanalysts may say that an individual without housing may possess feelings of worthlessness as a result of childhood abuse and neglect. Right? A behavioralist may say that a veteran may be triggered when returning from combat to civilian life, making a functioning at a job difficult. We've seen this with PTSD, right? Individuals who are returning from combat situations become hyperly vigilant to their environment, and that causes an emotional as well as physical duress. And when they're in that place, individuals will have a difficult time holding down a job and sustaining critical relationships within their lives, making it easier also to turn to other substances to cope with those stressors. Right? Cognitive theorists might say that an individual may not have learn the skills to apply for a job, maintain employment, or function successfully in life. Let's think about this. That sounds, some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, how could someone not learn that? How can someone not learn how to keep a job or to maintain employment? Well, remember, let's go back to those kids. The statistic is that the majority of individuals who are without housing in our society also have children. And they are watching their parents struggling to maintain employment, sometimes sobriety, sometimes housing, and all of these things. Where would that skill set come from then, right? A humanistic theorist might say an individual who made poor choices leading to homelessness may develop other priorities later at change and wish to make a change, right? We saw almost a reverse of this in Maurice's story, right? Maurice had said, you know what, I make an active decision to maintain my current status as an individual without housing, because that has led to a deeper reflection and aligned with my values of being a servant and creating change through advocacy, but being on the ground level, right? And so that would be an interesting perspective. A contextualist may say that homelessness is caused by a number of interrelated factors: a person's physical, cognitive, personality, and social worlds, right? All of these things coming together. An individual like a veteran returning from a combat situation, now struggling with what he or she experienced in that combat situation, and now attempting to see support with someone, with a group maybe that has not served in the military and has never been in combat. And so now trying to place some sense of normalcy on this situation, but not finding the support anywhere. And finally, evolutionary, going back to this notion, right, that a genetic flaw exists within the individual that has led to them either sometimes we hear this language, possessing a flawed work ethic, right? Or possessing a flawed ability to maintain their sobriety, and that it is the individual's own fault for finding themselves in the situation that they are in. So think about that for a second, and think about where your list of 10 um, perspectives, landed in the causality of homelessness, right? So again, what I wanted to do was I picked Individuals Without Housing to show you in a very practical way how our theoretical framework, right, can be applied to everyday situations, how lifespan development, what we experience, is a little more complex, right, than just the sum of where we are in our age brackets and our childhood, right? That there is oftentimes a multifaceted, what we refer to as multidimensional approach that we need to take to understanding how individuals change, evolve, grow, at times revert, right, throughout their lifespan. And so we will go ahead and end with this slide for today's lesson, and we will go ahead and close out today's lesson with our centering. Okay, and so what we're going to do is go ahead and close out with our centering activity today. I want to thank you all again for engaging in these discussions. I know that these topics are heavy, right? And I know that sometimes they're not easy to discuss. But part of my responsibility, I believe, as a faculty, is to make sure that we are applying, in a very practical sense, what the concepts that you're learning to the real world, so that the curriculum becomes alive for you. And so my hope is that sometimes, even though these are difficult conversations to have, they are enlightening for you as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to close out with our centering, and we have a scripture verse today from John, and a scripture word today, or a focus word today as well. This one from John, I really very much truly love. I think it's one of the more inspirational scripture verses for me in my life, right? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness shall not overcome it, right? Especially when we consider that in this last centering exercise, our hearts may be heavy, right? You may be feeling certain things, of emotions, of stress and anxiety. Maybe you're missing home. Maybe you are worried about a family member, or you're sad for some reason, right? What this tells us in John is that there is a light still shining in the darkness, and the darkness shall not overcome it. Reverend King had said it's in the darkest of nights which allow us to see the stars the best. And so finally, what we're going to do is close out with our centering word today, which will be hope. Hope, okay? So let's go ahead and make sure your hands and feet are in a nice, comfortable position. Let's give ourselves 2 minutes, right, to connect with God and to determine how God is speaking light, right, into our hearts, reminding us that the darkness has never overcome the light, nor will it ever, right? And let's focus on the fact that God is speaking hope into our hearts. So let's go ahead and make sure our hands and feet are in a nice, comfortable position. Let's go ahead and take that nice, deep breath and close your eyes, and I will keep track of the time. Okay, let's go ahead and take that nice deep breath. Go ahead and open your eyes and come on back. Folks, thank you so much for the lesson today. I may have indicated, I think I did last couple of lectures ago, that I discovered Bitmojis, and I had warned you, right? And so here it comes. Here it is. Here's your final Bitmoji, right? I was feeling like a razzle-dazzle day when I woke up this morning, and therefore that's my razzle-dazzle Bitmoji for you. So I want to say thank you so much for joining the lecture today. As always, check Blackboard, please, for your assignments and your due dates. Email me with any questions, thoughts, concerns, anything that you want to meet over. I'm happy to connect and do that with you. And also know that you are in my prayers. You are in my thoughts. Hang in there. You all are doing well. Thank you so much. And I look forward to our next lecture. Take care.